apologize. My paper is not the one that was announced. And the reason is that I made the mistake that I accused Simon Robertson of making earlier today, namely to decide before you have accomplished something that you are capable of accomplishing it. Unfortunately, I wasn't. So I'll read another paper that is very much connected, I think, with the issues of the conference, which has been wonderful so far. And I will start, if you don't mind, with a personal episode. So here it is. Late one night, many years ago, my efforts to stop having failed completely, I was still smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. I returned home that night only to realize that I had run out. I spent a good deal of time searching for a pack I was sure I had somewhere at home, but to no avail. The only places still open at that time of night were far from where I lived, and so I convinced myself to wait until morning before smoking again. In the morning, since my university was not in session, I remember the day exactly, it was Wednesday, May 11th, 1977, I didn't have to go to my office. So I decided to see whether I could last until lunch. And I did. That inspired me to try not to smoke until dinner, at which point I proposed to keep trying until the next morning, and I kept it in similar increments, morning, lunch, noon, and evening, to see how long I would last before I broke down and started smoking again. One morning, while I was reading, I realized that my hand had risen to my mouth, or had it raised itself, I don't know. And I remember speaking to myself in Greek, and I'm saying, stupid man, you're not holding a cigarette. And then trying to put the non-existent cigarette out where I used to keep my ashtray. So I was hallucinating, literally. But the game was still on for a good long while, always from morning to noon to night. I never won the game. It couldn't be won. It wasn't a game that could be won, since its goal was to see how long it would be before I relapsed. Which I had taken as a foregone conclusion. But I didn't lose the game either. Rather, sometime during the absolutely long and horrible year that followed, I realized that I had actually stopped smoking cigarettes, though at no point during that period was I aware that I was stopping or that I intended to stop. I was only concerned with reaching my next signpost, lunch or dinner. And for many years afterward, I felt that I couldn't claim credit for giving up cigarettes. It felt rather as if it was something that had happened to me, something of which I was not the real agent, as if while I was engaged in my very limited task of lasting another 4 hours or whatever it was, trying to persevere until the next stage, something, in some sense of course, in me was using those tasks to accomplish a purpose that was considerably more grand and all-encompassing. Of course, not nearly as grand and all-encompassing as the task that Nietzsche describes in Ecce Homo, but not dissimilar to it in the manner in which it was reached. And here's what Nietzsche writes. To become what one is, one must not have the slightest idea what one is. The whole surface of consciousness, consciousness is surface, must be kept clear of all great imperatives. Meanwhile, the organizing idea, as that in quotations, that is destined to rule, keeps growing deep down. It begins to command. Slowly, it leads us back from side roads and wrong roads. It prepares single qualities and fitnesses that will one day prove to be indispensable as means toward a whole. One by one, it trains all subservient capacities before giving any hint of the dominant task, goal, aim, or means. Now, if you read the passage quickly, you might think that it says that becoming what one is isn't a task that can be genuinely undertaken by those who actually eventually succeeded. Nietzsche seems to be saying that while you're engaged in various other projects, a separate, independent force with its own causal agency gradually leads you to become what you are, if you're one of the people who does become what he is. Not Nietzsche himself, not the conscious Nietzsche anyway, but a mysterious organizing idea, as he puts it, appears to be the true agent of this gradual process. Well, the imagery that Nietzsche uses in this passage, he says, I never even suspected what was growing in me, and one day all my capacities, suddenly ripe, leaped forth in their ultimate perfection. That image of that botanical image, if you want, recalls directly the preface to the genealogy. Here, in the preface, Nietzsche notes that his earliest ideas of the origins of morality were, and I quote, actually, when you read a paper about Nietzsche, you don't say I quote, because the prose is so much better than anything you could write, that one always knows that it's Nietzsche who's speaking and not you. So, but I will try anyway. So he writes that his views were already in essentials the same as the views he's about to articulate now. He then expresses the hope that the long interval has done them good, that they have become riper, clearer, stronger, more perfect, and speaks in a very triumphant tone of his conviction that they all arose out from a common root, from a fundamental will of knowledge, pointing imperiously into the depths, speaking more and more precisely, demanding greater and greater precision. For this alone, he continues, is fitting for a philosopher. We have no right to isolated acts of any kind. We may not make isolated errors or hit upon isolated truths. Rather, do our ideas, our values, our yeas and nays, our ifs and buts, grow out of us with the necessity with which a tree bears fruit, related in each with an affinity to each, an evidence of one will, one health, one soil, one sun. Now, contrary to a common interpretation of this passage, Nietzsche is not applying, as some people think, a general theory of human nature to philosophers. And the idea is that he has a general theory that we all have a causal essence inside of us, and we become whatever this causal essence is sort of programmed to become. I don't think that's what's going on. Far from providing a special case of a universal psychological principle, that everything that we do is the effect of the deep-seated, unalterable character, the unity of the philosopher's acts, errors, yeas and nays, is precisely the exception. Whether you like them, he continues, these fruits of ours, but what is that to the trees? What is it to us philosophers? Philosophers, he says, have no right to isolated acts of any kind. But how could anyone lack a right to behave in a manner that one was actually forced to become, but by one's own nature? That simply doesn't make very good sense. Neither unity of thought nor unity of character, according to Nietzsche, is given to us. It's something that we have to construct. It's something that we have to create. Some people, philosophy is not a manifestation of a unity that is already there, in other words, part of our genetic, so to speak, endowment. Rather, some people become philosophers because they're capable of giving their thought the unity that Nietzsche considers necessary for the practice of philosophy. It is precisely the organic interconnection of their ideas that qualifies these few people as philosophers in the first place. In any case, philosophers constitute too narrow a group to possess their own unalterable core. Would there also be cause for painters, for generals, for architects, for cobblers, or for clowns? Philosophy is one, perhaps the highest of the many ways in which what Nietzsche often calls strength is manifested. But strength and weakness are what the British philosopher Bernard Williams has called constitutive luck. In other words, some people are born strong, most people are not. It just happens. There's no particular reason why it happens. And strength and weakness, of course, are Nietzsche's broadest and most fundamental categories. Nothing is for him more widely shared and at the same time ethically salient. For that reason, though perfectly compatible, as I will try to argue, agency with freedom and responsibility, constitutive luck excludes their moral versions. Moral agency and responsibility, which require what Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil calls freedom in the superlative metaphysical sense. This moral agency and responsibility depend essentially not on features that, like strength and weakness, are unequally distributed among people, but on a talent that all rational beings possess to the same degree. Morality is impervious to constitutive luck. That's the whole point of morality, to say that the differences between us are irrelevant when it comes to what we are morally obliged to do. According to Nietzsche, however, only some people are capable of achieving the kind of unity that for him produces true character. Now, in a very widely discussed passage, one of my favorite in Nietzsche, Gay Science, section 290, he praises giving style to one's character as a great and rare art. The aim here is to fit the disparate elements of one's personality into what he calls an artistic plan that, as with the philosophers in the genealogy, reflects, I quote him, how the constraint of a single taste governed and formed everything large and small. Whether this taste is good or bad is less important than one might suppose, if only it was a single taste. The formation of character, he says somewhere else, requires, like all there has been on earth of freedom, subtlety, boldness, dance, and masterly sureness, constraint and a law of its own. Equally important, he writes that strong and domineering natures that enjoy the finest gaiety submit themselves willingly, even eagerly, to such constraints. By contrast, it is weak characters without power over themselves, he says, who hate the constraint of style. So for him, freedom is actually the product of submitting oneself to rules, certain rules or laws, not the ability to do things, whatever it is that one likes to do. So at this point, I think we're faced with a conflict. On the one hand, giving style to one's character is an art that requires long practice and daily work. On the other, becoming what one is requires having no notion of what one is, and succeeds only if one abandons himself to the operation of what he calls the organizing idea. How am I to practice for and work toward a goal of which I need to remain completely ignorant? This is the conflict that we have here. Now, I think that actually this conflict can be resolved, and to see how that works, I think we must first ask what sort of goal becoming what one is for Nietzsche, and for those who finally succeed at it. And what we find in various parts of Nietzsche is, for example, a description that people like him are human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. But to be unique and new and incomparable is for Nietzsche the same as to be an individual, an idea that permeates his thought. Today, he writes, the individual still has to be made possible. My idea, goals are lacking, and these are individuals. And that, as I'll now try to suggest, shows clearly that becoming who one is can be at best only what I will call an indirect goal. We cannot conceive as becoming what I am. We cannot pursue it directly. It's impossible to say what I'm going to be when I grow up is what I am. The reason is that if we want to say in general terms what an individual is, and that's something that came up this afternoon in Simon's paper, the best we can do is to say something to the effect that an individual is someone who is significantly different from the rest of the world. The difference must be significant, because Nietzsche believes, as we see in Gay Science 335, that everyone is already an individual in a trivial sense. We're all different from one another. We don't have the same history. No two people have the same history. So no two people can possibly be, strictly speaking, identical. But that is no accomplishment. One thing I detest about North American education is the following. When my son was little, I would take him to school every day, and especially at the beginning of the year, the teachers would say, "We are so grateful that you're giving us our children to educate. Each one is so unique. You must be so proud of it." And I said, why should I be proud of the fact that my son is different from that boy and that girl? That's not an interesting thing. The question is what he makes of himself. That's where pride and accomplishment comes in. So an individual who does deserve praise is newly, importantly, strikingly, admirably, unexpectedly, and if you're Nietzsche, also perhaps disturbingly, dangerously, even barbarically perhaps, different from the rest of the world. Someone who, for one reason or another, stands out in comparison to whom the rest of the world is simply background. For better or worse, though, it is impossible to specify what counts as new, important, admirable, and so on, in terms that are both general and informative. If we could, these, whatever terms we use to say what an individual or what newness is, if we could, then these terms would in fact constitute instructions, laws for becoming an individual. But that is impossible, since to follow such rules, far from giving oneself laws as Nietzsche wants, is to obey laws set down by another, and if successful, merely to reproduce something that has already been accomplished. But that is just what becoming an individual is not. The undertaking of becoming an individual by following certain already set down rules is self-undermining. And a little dialogue with the gay science, I think, shows exactly what Nietzsche has in mind. A says to B, what, you want no imitators? And B says, I do not want people to imitate my example. I wish that everybody would fashion his own example, just as I do. This is the issue here. Recalling the passage from Nehamas with which I began, we can now, I think, agree that having no notion of what one is may, in fact, be necessary for becoming what one is. But not because one must let some independent force do all the work, but because one can only have that notion of what becoming what one is if it is possible to specify what would count as that in advance of accomplishing it. And that, as I just argued, is impossible. It would be, if you did that, what you would achieve would either be empty, or if informative, it would specify something that had already been done by someone else. The first would point nowhere, the second at best to a copy, at worst to a travesty. By being in that way misleading, both would actually be obstacles to achieving one's goal. That's why one must not have a notion of what one is. Because if you do, it will prevent you from accomplishing what you want, rather than the other way around. This ignorance is necessary because of the kind of goal becoming what one is actually represents. A goal that cannot be specified in advance of achieving it. But certainly not every goal, not even every significant goal, is like that. And there is no reason to think that Nietzsche is making a general point about the inefficacy of the human will. Nevertheless, this organizing idea, which seems to take over and become the real agent when unspecifiable goals are pursued, remains mysterious. That it is unconscious is clear enough. But that doesn't by itself make the conscious individual its unwitting instrument. Nietzsche is neither a common vulgar Freudian nor a classical determinist. Unlike determinists, he denies that human freedom is in any way affected by the laws of nature for the rather trivial reason, in this context, that there are no laws of nature. Nor does his notion of an unalterable core have any determinist implications, since both strength and weakness are very broad and and vague categories. Of course, the strong, Nietzsche is very clear, will inevitably act strongly, and the weak will inevitably act weakly. But the virtuous too act virtuously, and the vicious viciously, while the talented accomplish more than the untalented, and no one thinks that this interferes with anybody's freedom. Achilles could have acted heroically, still act heroically, if he had spared Hector's life. There was that alternative. He could still be a hero and spare Hector's life, instead of killing him and then desecrating his body. And nothing, I add, that Nietzsche says makes it impossible for Achilles to have run away from Hector, as earlier in the Iliad, Paris runs away from Menelaus. Now this possibility that, for all we know, Achilles might have run away from Hector, however unlikely, shows that although perhaps it is only, as Nietzsche writes, at the end, in connection with giving style to one's character, it is only at the end, when the work is finished, that it becomes evident how the constraint of a single pace governed and formed everything larger. When the work is actually finished is a matter of interpretation. It's not a given. Until the duel, Achilles' actions have given us every reason to think of himself as a hero. To think, so to speak, that heroism was the single pace that had unified his life. But suppose that Homer had written that he actually ran away. Then we would have to go back and reinterpret our understanding of his behavior up to now, and it might well turn out that the most reasonable interpretation, even of the past actions of Achilles, in light of this unexpected retreat, shows that we have been wrong. The work hadn't yet been finished, and Achilles wasn't and really hadn't been the hero after all. Nothing makes this supposition impossible or even counterintuitive. This last point reinforces Nietzsche's view, as I believe, that strength is as strength does. Strength and weakness, for that matter, can't be separated from its expressions. Strength may not determine the specific behavior that expresses it, so Achilles could have spared Hector's life, or he could have killed him, and that would still be an expression of his heroism. But no one can be both strong and act in ways that are characteristic of weakness. The strong can't choose to act weakly any more than the weak can choose to act strongly. That is the main point of the famous section 13 in the first essay of the genealogy. In particular, we can't attribute a feature like strength to someone independently of their acting in the appropriate way. To think what we can is something that I call Raskolnikov's mistake, is to think that you are a special person, and therefore, before you've done anything, and therefore that you are entitled to perform a certain unbelievable deed, perform the deed, and then find that you couldn't stand up to it, you couldn't make it. And that's exactly the kind of character Nietzsche describes in Zarathustra as the pale criminal. An image, he writes, made this pale man pay. He was equal to his deed when he did it, because he did it, but he could not bear its image after it was done. And he is defined by that deed for the rest of his life. Both of them demonstrate what he writes in the genealogy: to demand of strength that it should not express itself as strength is just as absurd as to demand of weakness that it express itself as strength. Strength, in other words, is less the cause of strong actions for Nietzsche than what these actions express. It's a very different relationship than the causal relationship that we generally attribute to such features. And in many cases, what an action expresses, and namely, and in fact what it is not determinate until it is complete, whenever exactly that is. And as long as the nature of the action is indeterminate, the same would be true of the intention with which it has been undertaken. And when intention is itself indeterminate, it no more determines the nature of the action that is being performed than it is determined by it. The relationship between an intention and the action, contrary to, I think, what is the reigning view in North American philosophy that derived from Donald Davidson, is not a causal relation, but a hermeneutical. That is what I'm trying to argue. let me explain what I mean by this, and I'll have to do it by means of an example, not drawn directly from philosophy of action, but from literary and artistic interpretation. The debate about whether an intention is relevant to the interpretation of an essay or a work of art in general began when two scholars, Wimsatt and Beardsley, wrote a famous paper called The Intentional Fallacy in 1946. There they defined intention as a design or plan in the author's mind, and argued that, understood this way, which is the only way they could think of it, the intention is both inaccessible, we can't know what it is in most cases, and even when accessible, it is irrelevant to both the sense and the value of the literary work. The argument was, look, if the intention was successful, then you can see it in the work. If it wasn't successful, when the work doesn't express it, so it's irrelevant to the interpretation. I believe that this argument is completely conclusive, and that no attempt to rehabilitate intention, if you construe it that way, can be successful. That doesn't mean, of course, that people haven't tried to show that this is a wrong view. And in a very recent book, one of the very serious American aestheticians, Noel Carroll, contends that yes, we can find the intentions of artists in many ways, including, he writes, most obviously, the fact that we may be told the intention by the artist herself. Well, are we to believe what the artist tells us? True, if the issue is what Noel Carroll is interested in his book, namely, for example, whether a work belongs to a certain recognizable artistic category or tradition or classification. His examples are, for example, is Dürer's self-portrait a portrait? Or is Robert Musil writing a psychological novel when he writes Young Torres? Well then, we would have every reason to believe that the artist could tell us, yes, it's a portrait, yes, it's a psychological novel, but then we have no reason to need the artist telling us because it is absolutely obvious. You don't need anybody to tell you whether Dürer's self-portrait is a portrait. So again, it's either inaccessible or irrelevant. The intention, in other words, to write a psychological novel does not distinguish Robert Musil from several thousand or tens of thousands other authors who are engaged in also writing psychological novels. It provides a totally elementary interpretation of his novel that we may perhaps use as a very, very first step in our effort to understand the work. And his specific intention, if you can speak of a single intention in connection with such a heavy work, becomes apparent only as, and to the extent that, we develop a reasonable interpretation of the novel, much, much more specific than it's a psychological novel. Here, as in all complicated activities, right, whether it's writing a novel, going on a journey, planting a garden, or becoming a philosopher, both agents and interpreters begin with a very hazy idea that can't possibly correspond to the intention that is manifested once the action in question is actually complete, whenever that is. In such cases, the intention literally comes into being along with the action itself. The two of them come together. It's not that the intention pre-exists and brings the action about. The intention comes into being along with the action. By contrast, if from a house in Athens I want to walk to the Acropolis, I can follow several different paths and still achieve my goal. The same intention to go to the Acropolis can be expressed or realized in very different ways. But if Musil had written even a relatively different novel, his intention in writing it would have been a different one. An action like writing a novel or a series of actions of this sort doesn't allow any easy distinction between what is intended on the one hand and the manner in which the intention is realized. That's what we mean, I think, very often when we say that in the arts the what and the how can't be separated from one another. Now, a philosopher from England, Aaron Ridley, has written very well on this topic, and that's what he says. The conditions that tell you whether an action is successful in those cases are, he writes, internal to the execution. What counts as success cannot be non-trivially specified in advance and independently of some particular way of meeting them. Non-trivial, serious success conditions emerge only during the course of the execution, so that the full character of our intention is revealed only in my successfully acting on it. I don't merely confirm that I intended to do such and such, or find out that I intended more than I thought. Rather, I discover what it was to have intended to do such and such, and so discover something about myself. That is part, I think, of what it means to say that with these sorts of actions, in particular with actions whose goals are indirect in the sense that I tried to develop earlier on, the relationship between intention and action is hermeneutical. And that is the way that Nietzsche understands action expressively. The intention is expressed in the action, and only when the action is complete. What exactly the intention is another question. But what it is not is a cause. Here's Nietzsche. People, he writes, are accustomed to consider the goal, purposes, vocations, etc., as the driving force, in keeping with a very ancient error. But it is merely the directing force. One has mistaken the helmsman for the steam, and not even always the helmsman, the directing force. Imagine now that we are planning to go to a movie tonight, and I say to you, and mean it, I really don't care what I see. I can go to any movie you like. You choose. And as soon, however, as you say, let's go see Last Year in Marienbad, I say, no, I really want to see Avengers 12, or whatever the latest Hollywood happens to be. In such cases, we have no difficulty in saying that I didn't know what I wanted all along until I spoke. I didn't know myself, so to speak, until I actually uttered the words. And what if, in the process of trying to tell you, of giving you a sincere compliment on your recent accomplishment or paper, whatever it is, I end up, surprisingly to me, sounding very ambivalent, perhaps even negative, and find myself regretting my words. So I want to tell you what a great accomplishment, what a great essay you wrote, and say, well, your essay was good, it was a little long, and you know, the vocabulary was sort of limited, and the idea was, I'd heard it before. You know, and then say, my God, what did I say? Well, if that happens, it seems natural to say that I simply failed to say what I intended, which is that I liked your essay. I am still, so to speak, from this particular point of view, to say that I'm still the person I was before I spoke, the person who likes the essay, and what I regret is my inability to find the right words for my feelings, and I have to find a better way to express myself. I don't deny that I may have hated your essay all along without knowing it, and that my intention to tell you that this week was unconscious. But I do want to deny now that this is the only or the most obvious interpretation of what happened when I uttered the words that are at least ambivalent, if not negative, although I intended, as you say, to compliment you. Here's what the expressive attitude towards action would envisage. Against this other approach, it will argue that my words are accurate. They reveal that I actually don't like myself. It denies that my negative view must have been there unconsciously all along. Instead, it takes the intention to reject your essay to have emerged, literally, to have come into being, as I uttered the words I used in order to talk to you about it. What had earlier, according to the first view, seemed like an error of expression, now seems like good evidence that I was not what I had taken myself to be. That was the mistake is not in finding the wrong word, choosing the wrong words to express myself. The mistake is having thought in advance that I liked your essay, and then finding out that in fact I didn't. I was not who I had taken myself to be, namely the person who liked your essay. And now, instead of trying to find the words to express myself better, I must either acknowledge my feelings and live with them, or maybe look at the essay again and maybe try to see if I can come to a different appreciation of it. On the first alternative that I used before, I can still claim to be the person who likes your paper, either haven't yet, or perhaps ever, found the right words to express my admiration. On the second, expressive view, perhaps sadly, who I am is constituted not by unrealized possibilities, I try to tell you how good it was when I failed, but only by the possibilities I realize and by the plans I fulfill. Regret for what I did or didn't do is not guilt for having chosen the wrong action within a field of alternative possibilities, each one of which I could have taken if I wanted. But the painful realization that my action revealed that I was inferior to what I had supposed or hoped. It's a species of shame. My action fails in this context, not when it fails to realize the intention with which I undertook it, but when I can't see myself, that is, the self I want to be, in it. Well, it succeeds, not because it fulfills the intention of prompted it, but because I can see myself, that is, the self I want to be, in it. And that is exactly what Nietzsche is after when, through a very loose reading of Spinoza, he produces a non-moral explanation of the morsus conscientiae, the bite of conscience, in the genealogy. He writes, mischief makers overtaken by punishments have for thousands of years felt in respect of their transgressions just as Spinoza did. Namely, here something has unexpectedly gone wrong. I found something around myself that I didn't expect to be there. I ought not to have done that. And in his notes, he writes, the bite of conscience, sign that the character is not equal to the deed, like Raskolnikov or the pale criminal. So to understand a particular action, from the most simple to the most complex, from the most banal to the most unusual, from the everyday to the artistic, we need to know the intention it manifests. So I'm a certain distance from you, and you are waving at me like this. What are you doing? Do you intend to say hello? You can say goodbye? Or are you warning me that a bear is coming out at me from behind and I haven't seen it yet? I can't ask you, you're too far away. So what I will do to find your intention is I will relate what you're now doing, waving, to what you were doing before or what you do afterward. If, when you saw me and waved, you then started running toward me with a smile on your face, then you're saying hello. If, as soon as you wave, you turn away and start walking away, you said goodbye. If you run, you're warning me that the danger is going on, is happening. Now, this is a manufactured and rather sort of gross example, not very realistic, but it makes the point I'm trying to make clearly. To understand your intention, it's not that I have to look into your mind. I can't look into your mind. In any case, your intention is not there. What I must do is to relate what you're now doing with other things that you did or will do. Even asking you, after all, is eliciting more behavior from you. You see, when I ask you what are you doing, you tell me something, but that is only a bit of evidence that I will use in order to decide what it was that in fact you are doing. To understand your action, I need to know your intention. And in learning what the intention is, which I do by relating your action to other behavior of yours, I learn something more general about it. Not that you're just waving, or rather more specific, not that you're just waving at me, but that you're saying hello, or saying goodbye, or warning me of some danger. So I start with a general idea of what you're doing, waving, and then I specify, you said hello. My sense of an action, therefore, goes hand in hand with my sense of the agent, or some aspect of the agent that is expressed in it. And to do that, I must determine how present behavior is affected by other things that the agent has done, is doing, or will do in the future. And that, whatever that is, it affects what the agent has already done. In other words, I must relate what I see one is doing with what I already know, or will come to know about that agent, and fit it all into a coherent account. But what I already know about that agent may change in light of that new action, as with Achilles. If Achilles had run away, I said, my God, after all, he wasn't a hero, and what about this thing that he did before? I'll have to try to reinterpret it and find out that and determine that, in fact, he wasn't a hero, despite what we thought. The relationship between what we know about people and what we see them do in the present is, like everything else in this paper, hermeneutic. And establishing such hermeneutic connections is the business of interpretation. as a present action, as I was saying, may require me to revise what occurred earlier, as with Achilles, so a future action may require a revision of the present. Here's Nietzsche from the Nachlass. The most recent history of an action relates to this action, but further back lies a prehistory which covers a wider field. An individual action is at the same time part of a much more extensive later fact. The briefer and the more extended processes are not separated. Now, what exactly is the role of appealing to intention in an interpretation of behavior? Elizabeth Anscombe, many years ago, showed that whenever somebody either expresses the intention to go shopping, or goes shopping, or go shopping intentionally, or go shopping with a particular intention, those are various cases, we can always ask why. Why did this person do that? And interestingly to me, and it's not something that she actually made a point of, in all three cases, we can answer by a statement in the present tense. Why is he going shopping? Or why does he intend to go shopping? Because he is buying shoes. Even though, in many cases, the action is in the future. I still can speak of it in the present tense. Such answers, in other words, locate the action we are asking about with what Nietzsche just called the more extensive later fact. You say, why is he going to go to shopping this afternoon? He's buying shoes. You say, why is he buying shoes? Well, because he's going hiking. Right? In all cases, what you do is nest a particular, a narrower description of an action between a broader one, or a more general, if you want, description of an action, within a more particular one. And the more remote the event that connects the present action to that more extended process, as Nietzsche calls it, the more appropriate it is to specify it with because, coupled with psychological verbs like wanting, planning, or intending. In other words, if the event is very far in the future, you will say, I intend to. If the event is a bit closer, you'll say, I am doing it. And so the distinction between speaking in terms of intention and speaking in terms of action is not between talking about the person's mind versus the person's behavior. It's simply addressing the behavior from a different temporal point of view. So I'll skip the next paragraph. Our understanding of both intention and action is therefore provisional, especially when complicated activities are involved. The activities of art are one, but not the only example. It is impossible to have access to an intention independently of interpreting the activity in question. And the reason we must understand the intention is that we can only understand the activity by placing it within a broader context, all of which becomes relevant to our interpretation and constitutes, so to speak, a dynamic whole. It is not settled once and for all, and new elements may well cause us to revise our earlier understanding of a particular action. When, by contrast, we try to fix the intention once and for all, to locate a discrete mental state which has already fully occurred and produced or caused the activity, our understanding is bound to be, as I suggested in connection with the aesthetics discussion before, partial, generic, and unilluminated. So, if intention is not the cause of the action, what is it? Well, I think there are two ways of looking at it. One way of looking at it says that when we ask for an intention of an action, what we're asking for is license to connect the behavior that we see in front of us with past and future behavior by that agent. From another point of view, I think the intention is nothing other than the complete, or as complete a description of an action as we can possibly have. It is not, in other words, an independent object that is the cause of the action or what this action means, even if it's a failure, but rather what an action itself fully and exactly is. In other words, when we ask what did Musil or Shakespeare or whatever intend to do, the answer we expect is as good a specification of what the poem means or whatever as we can possibly have. So when we specify the intention, we in fact are specifying the action itself. Nietzsche wouldn't be surprised by this. Again, the Nachlass, he asks a question. Is intention the cause of an event? Or is that also illusion? is it not the event itself? The event that is, which it is exactly what interpretation and criticism aim to specify. But to understand what anything is, we need to relate it to other things, to see how it affects and how they affect it. And we can only do this to the extent that we relate those other things in their turn to still other things. And that requires us to understand these other things as well, which we can only do by relating them to still other things, and so on without end. The implication of that is that we never understand anything fully. And I think that's right. When we say we have exhausted something, that there's nothing more, it's not the object which is exhausted, because the object always has more features than we say. We are exhausted by our effort to understand it. To say then that I did something because I intended to do X or I was doing X is not to refer to a distinct mental state, as I was saying, of which I'm clearly aware. It's rather to indicate how a particular action fits in with the rest of my behavior. To say that it makes sense and that it is, to that extent, understandable. I am saying, and that's something I can certainly be wrong about, that I see and recognize myself or the other person in it. But to make an action understandable is simply to offer a reasonable interpretation of it. An interpretation, far from unearthing the secret meaning of things or the mental states that underlie the behavior, simply aims to locate those things in a continually broadening framework. I'm very suspicious of the whole idea of looking deeply into things and finding out what is hidden between them. I prefer out of depth to stay with the surface, the skin, the fold, and as Nietzsche describes the leaps in the preface to the Gay Science. Since that context consists of larger actions which are the threads in process, it is always incomplete, and what those larger actions are is constantly subject to change. From the blooming, buzzing confusion of movements, sights, and sounds around us, we carve out distinct intervals that correspond to actions. But exactly for that reason, because there is this total confusion, what's happening in this room right now is just a constant sort of alteration of states. And out of that, I carve it into persons, into movement. Somebody is moving her head that way, another person is half asleep, and I make sort of different actions of it. But precisely because of that, my understanding of those actions and where they begin and where they end is also a matter of interpretation. So what counts as the beginning of an action, more generally of an event, depends on what other events we relate to it in the process of interpreting. That is especially the case with activities that have indirect goals, goals whose achievement is not independent of the way in which they are pursued, and are unforeseeable until the activities that result in them are over. And when they are over, once again, is established by more interpretation, and in connection with our background interests. A new step may require a new interpretation of what has already occurred, and events that occur after the end we have assigned to that activity may create a different context, impose a new interpretation, and assign it a different beginning and a different end. Historians do that all the time. We mustn't assume that the nature of an action is fixed once and for all by this antecedent mental cause, the intention. Indirect goals cannot possibly be the objects of such a cause, or the effects of such a cause, since those who aim at them have no conception of what they will be. If they did, they would not produce anything interesting or new. For that reason, indirect goals, say creating a great painting, are achieved, if at all, by doing something else. Adding a figure to the right half of the painting, contrasting a color here with a color there. Your aim is never to produce a great painting. That doesn't tell you anything about what you're going to do. Your aim is to paint a crucifixion or an abstract picture or whatever it is. Is it then because we don't reach such goals with a secret idea of what they are, because we reach them by doing something else, that we are really not responsible for them? That it's not us, but the organizing idea which does it, and that is something other than ourselves. No, and Nietzsche doesn't think that it is. He writes, even the blunders of life have their own meaning and value. The occasional side roads and wrong roads, the delays, modesties, seriousness wasted on tasks that are remote from the task, all this can express great prudence, even the supreme prudence, where know thyself, Simon, would be the recipe for ruin, forgetting oneself, misunderstanding oneself, making oneself smaller, narrower, mediocre, become reason itself. That's from the same section that I did the very beginning statement. How could Nietzsche characterize such actions as manifestations of prudence, the most forward-looking of the virtues, if he thought that he or any other successful human being had nothing to do with becoming what he is? True, he goes on to say that he became a professor and a philologist, although, quote, no such idea had ever entered my mind. He also takes credit for, quote, the hard psychology of the scholar, evident in his third meditation on history, on the uses and disadvantages of history of life, saying also in Ege Homo that his hard psychology of the scholar expresses the feeling of distance, the profound assurance about what could be my task and what could only be means en part in minor works. It shows my prudence that I was many things and in many places in order to be able to become one thing, to be able to attain one thing. I had to be a scholar too, for some time. Now, some people think that when he said that, he said it was determined that you become a scholar. That was his causal essence that produced the desire and the ability to be a scholar. I don't think so at all. I think he had to be a scholar, not because he was compelled to do so by the causal order of things or his nature, or because his unalterable core gave him no choice, but because, bear with me here, had he not been a scholar, he would not have become what he is. And there is no reason to think that had he not become that, what he is, he would have accomplished anything else worthwhile. To think that he might would have to go against the most basic principle that underlies his thought of the eternal recurrence. That, namely, that we can remove a significant piece of a person's life, but leave that person intact. Namely, well, let's imagine Nietzsche not having gone to classics and not having taught at the University of Basel. In fact, we can't be imagining Nietzsche if we imagine that. And as somebody was saying earlier today, all of Nietzsche's features are necessary to him. And the reason that this is impossible, that we can't separate, a part of a person and leave the person intact, is that when one has become what one is, no piece, so to speak, of one's life is independent of any other. Every action casts light on every other, and to remove one would cause the rest to collapse. And to specify that in the relation in as much detail as possible is to gradually reveal the one intention, the unified character of the agent. Intention is a word that takes us from individual action through its relations to others to the character that is expressed in it. It's a license to connect this with everything else. It happened, so to speak, that Nietzsche became a professor because he was not at all anticipating such a career. He finished his studies, he was not yet finished with his studies, and his teacher said, go teach, and he got this amazing chair, and he followed it at the age of, 26 or whatever. But most of what happens to others in life is just like that. It happens to us. What matters is not that these happenings may be chance events, but what we can do with them once they have occurred. And if what we accomplish as a result is worthwhile, if that is, it makes other things possible and can be explained by appealing to its contributions to a larger whole that is itself worthwhile, then I think it is reasonable to assume responsibility for it, not in a moral sense, to turn it into part of what we are. Zarathustra, I walk among men as among the fragments of the future, that future which I envisage. And this is all my creating and striving, that I create and carry together into one what is fragment and riddle and dreadful action. And how could I dare to be a man if man were not also a creator and guesser of riddles and redeemer of accidents? To redeem those who lived in the past and to recreate what it was into thus I willed it, that alone I would call redemption. Thus I willed it, even though it was something that happened to me. And so I accept it, along with everything that made it possible, which for Nietzsche is everything. I do not, he writes, nec homo, in the least that anything should become different than it is. I myself do not want to become different. There was, of course, I'm about to finish, there was, of course, no reason why Nietzsche became a professor of philology. That had only causes. But he gave it a reason because he is able to use what being a philologist involved, and not necessarily consciously, as material for the rest of his life and accomplishment. His way of reading things and his way of writing things were essentially formed by his philological background. And another thing, he also says he's grateful to the headaches that he had, because of those headaches he learned how to write in short spurts, because he didn't have time to write treatises or whatever. So therefore, even his ill health is something that, his suffering, so to speak, that is given meaning, and therefore is worthwhile, and he would repeat it again if he were to live. Nothing in Ecce Homo, as far as I can see, suggests that Nietzsche refuses to take credit for the accomplishment the work's subtitle proclaims, which is how one becomes what one is. Everything, though, suggests that his accomplishment was neither to choose what happened to him, nor to pursue a goal of which he was antecedently aware. Rather, it was to have been able to exploit what happened to him, including, as I said, even his ill health, to his advantage. He writes, in the midst of the torments that go with an uninterrupted 3-day migraine, accompanied by laborious vomiting of phlegm, I possessed a dialectician's clarity par excellence, and thought through with very cold blood matters for which, under healthier circumstances, I am not mountain climber, no subtle, not cold enough. But whether he or anyone could use what happened to him to his advantage, in what in fact advantage consists, can be determined in advance. It is only after the work is finished, after one has become what he calls one thing, that the advantage is established, and one can try, to whatever extent possible, to explain what that is. The explanation, moreover, will consist in showing how it is interrelated with, how it affects, and it is affected by everything else that makes that particular life worthwhile. Everything that enables Nietzsche and anyone else who has experienced such a great moment as he does on his 44th birthday to be grateful, as he says, to his whole life. And so, though it doesn't necessarily fill me with quite so much gratitude, I too will claim the responsibility for giving up cigarettes as a result of what happened to me that early May morning all these years ago. Thank you very much.